Yay. Okay. Do you want to start off by introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Should I say a little bit about myself or? Okay. So I'm a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist in private practice in New York. I My full-time job is my private practice where I see patients anywhere from 1 to 4 times a week. They come in to see me. And if you think 4 times a week is a lot, the topic, that you and I will be talking about today is part of a personality. Things are in our personality,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes a lot of work to change one's personality. So oftentimes we see that people may come in more frequently who are a little more motivated to
Mm-hmm.
change things in the personality. So the full-time job is teach the private practice. Then I also teach. For many years, I taught in academia, and
Mm-hmm.
now I teach at these what are called postgraduate training institutes, which is for people who graduated already and they want to go on for further training to really understand how to do the work of therapy. So
Okay.
I teach classes on personality disorders. And what else do I do? I have a podcast that I started about maybe 6 months ago or so. So I have a podcast called the Narcissism Decoder. It's about all aspects related to narcissism. And I have a YouTube channel. So the difference is the podcast goes a little bit deeper in depth. Maybe we bring in a little bit of theory. The
Mm-hmm.
videos are a little shorter, snappier, and they get right to the point. So, and I'm also very involved in the psychoanalytic community. I sit on various boards. I present a lot of papers. I publish some works. So that's what keeps me busy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
of course.
I was a little intrigued by the fact that people come in 4 times a week. I had no idea, but damn, okay.
Yeah, yeah. What happens is sometimes when you start working with personality disordered
Mm-hmm.
patients,
Mm-hmm.
and they begin to realize that there are some serious problems or they have some serious limitations in life and in relationships, which
Mm-hmm.
I think you and I will talk about a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Once you could spark their curiosity and get them interested in thinking about their life, I think they begin to realize talking to somebody, once a week could be really helpful, right? Twice a week is even more valuable. But when they
Mm-hmm.
start coming in, maybe 3 or 4 times a week,
Mm-hmm.
that's really where you start to see big changes in one's personality.
Okay.
Yeah,
With regards to that, I do have a question for you, but I
yeah,
think we'll
please.
ask that much later. Because
Okay,
I think that's like that might be a spiral of a question. So I think I'll keep that
okay.
for the end. Okay. So if we can just start off talking about, narcissistic romantic relationships, and maybe emotional responses with regards to that will be nice.
hmm So let me say just one thing. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I've listened to some of your prior interviews,
Mhm.
so I know that you're familiar with narcissistic relationships.
Mhm.
And I guess if we just start in a very general way,
Mhm.
what's something that you may typically hear, for instance, in terms of like a narcissistic relationship? I'm asking because there are so many different directions we could go because there are very different types of
Mhm.
narcissistic relationships, but
Mhm.
we should probably start with the one that's most common. So, what might be something that you hear as you're interviewing people or you're on social media and you're listening to people's stories?
Mhm. So, this has come up with interviews, but I also have to say this is something that's come up with people in real life that I know that are narcissistic. Like they've been
hmm
diagnosed with NPD and they have shared this with me as well directly. Not quite sure why, but they do feel at a certain point in their relationship where they dismiss their partners and sometimes it's
hmm
pretty conscious as well. But um
Okay, wait, let's just start with that, okay?
uh-huh, uh-huh.
Because that what you just touched on is probably one of the central features of narcissism,
Mm-hmm.
in my perspective at least,
Mm-hmm.
which is if you think about different attachment styles,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they're referred to as like the dismissive attachment style.
Mhm.
And what that really looks like is what? Like, what kind of stories do you hear? That they get in these romantic relationships and they have this feeling like, what?
Mhm.
I don't really care. Like,
Mhm.
I don't really care about my partner, or, sometimes they could even be quite cruel or critical or devaluing of their partner, right?
Mhm.
Or if their partner is doing something, let's say just hypothetically, like they're going out with friends, or they're taking a trip with their girlfriends, or they're going
Mhm.
to a bar, they can have this feeling of like, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever. I'm like, it doesn't bother me. Do whatever
Mhm.
you want. I don't
Mhm.
know if that's similar to what you've heard, but that's sort of, when you said dismissive, that nicely captures sort of
Mhm.
the essence of what I think is at the core of narcissism, is what we call the grandiose sense of self. That's really
Mhm.
one of the defining characteristics of the narcissistic personality. And that's part of the grandiose sense of self, this dismissive attitude, as if they don't care.
What do you mean as if? Do you mean they do care?
Well, this is the paradox, okay?
Uh-huh.
They will present as if they don't care. But if you listen even to some of your interviews, right? And I've listened
Uh-huh.
to plenty, and I sit with these patients. When
Mhm.
you listen very closely, something happens that's very curious. Like, in one breath, they'll say, whatever, I don't care. I'm not the jealous type, right? They could do whatever they want. That's the dismissive part. But
Mhm.
then we have to look at two things, okay?
Mhm.
One is, it's called like the contiguity of associations. What follows the question? What follows when they're talking about this kind of relationship? And oftentimes what you'll hear is, but then when she wants to break up with me, right?
Mhm.
All of a sudden I feel like I'm invested in the relationship.
Mhm.
And then they do care. They don't want to lose the relationship.
Mhm.
So what I'm suggesting is that there's then a bit of a paradox, right? They could say they don't care, but paradoxically, they do care. So, but let's go to number two, okay?
Mhm. Mhm.
And this is where the devil is in the details, and this part is really important. So let's go back to the hypothetical example when the girlfriend goes out to the bar or
Mhm.
travels with friends,
Mhm.
and they say, I don't care. And then you say to them, okay, I understand that, but can you tell me, what was your night like? What did you do that night? And they'll
Hmm.
say, what? Like, what? Just like you just did. Like, what?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And typically what you find
Mhm.
is either they went out too and got intoxicated or high.
Mhm.
They go in sometimes into like like a depressive state,
Okay.
right?
Uh,
Where they'll just sit home. They can't even like put a meal together for themselves,
oh.
right? Or they'll skip a meal, or they'll turn compulsively to something,
Mhm.
pornography, whatever one can imagine doing compulsively.
Mhm.
And all of these things are signs that this separation had an incredibly important impact on them, but not one that they consciously register, right? Because they're in that illusion of, that's the grandiose sense of self again, right? The core of the narcissistic structure is the grandiosity, the illusion of independence. I don't need anybody. So if you're going out with your girlfriends, I don't care. That's, if we put a technical term on it, I'm borrowing a little bit from psychoanalytic theory.
Mhm.
It's called an affective block. It's a block in feeling any feel emotions towards somebody else,
Hmm.
any dependency needs. All of that has to be disavowed and denied.
So, okay, I know. Okay. So, despite the grandiosity, um, couldn't the fear of abandonment still be there if the partner is out with their friends? Like
Well, no,
despite the.
that well, that's what I'm suggesting. That's the paradox.
Mhm.
Is it the fear of abandonment is there?
Mhm.
But let me just say this. Maybe there are different levels of consciousness, okay?
Mhm.
So one level is I can turn to something and go get high,
Mhm.
and I could ward off those feelings, right? So consciously, there are no feelings of abandonment, right? Why? Because they're not being abandoned. How are they not being abandoned? Because they replace it. It's like they put a patch over it. So if you engage in if you go out and you get drunk or high, or you just sit all night watching pornography, you're not in a painful reality. Do you see what I mean? You're no longer sitting in a painful reality dealing with emotions. You're patching over them with something else. Does that make sense?
That
I
makes
can keep
total
going.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why I was saying I gave that example, and I'm so glad you picked up on when I said it's as if they don't care. But just the as if is you have to look very closely. I'm just reviewing the contiguity of what they're saying, what follows in their associations, and some of them will actually say, yeah, I don't care. And then a couple sentences later, they'll say, yeah, but then I fall apart and I become very depressed when she, threatens to break off the relationship. It's like, wait a minute, how could you become depressed if you don't care? If you really didn't care and there's really no attachment there of any kind, right? There's no libidinal connection at all. Then she talks about leaving the relationship. It's like, okay, goodbye. Don't let the door hit you in the. And anyway, so that was one. And then you have to pay very close attention to what they do when the significant other leaves. And that will tell you a lot more than the manifest words of, I don't care what she does. I'm not a jealous type of person.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, this might be a bit of a twisted question with regards to what you said. So you spoke about the patch, right?
Yes.
Okay. And any sort of distraction could be a patch.
Yes, absolutely.
So cheating is also a distraction. So at the risk, I don't know how to put this, but could a narcissistic person who's cheating on their partner, could that distraction be a way to keep that relationship going?
That's an interesting question. That's a very, so let me just think for a second, because the question implies that if they're not cheating, right, that the relationship may be in jeopardy. Am I understanding that correctly?
Of like boring, maybe?
Like what? I'm sorry?
Like the relationship might be boring if there's no cheating.
Oh, yes, 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 yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is the biggest part. So if we go back to this illusion of perfection, the grandiosity, I mean, this is what you typically hear in social media. I mean, this is like sort of the like the character, like the most common way narcissists are described, right? The grandiose narcissist. Don't worry, I'm not going to digress too far, but I'll just say for your listeners, there are different types of narcissists, and the grandiose is one particular type of narcissism. But if they're not getting enough of those supplies in their relationship, right? Because that's also another feeling that they typically have, is it's never enough. They need more and more and more, right? More glitter, more shine, more to bolster their very weak ego. So yes, if they're not getting enough in the relationship, cheating, having an affair is the perfect solution.
So with regard, okay, so if isn't being a good partner also a source of validation though? Like,
Let's talk about let's talk about that, because it's important to note that there are different types of narcissistic relationships. So in other words, one can be in a relationship and on the surface it appears to be going just fine, like it's like really the best relationship. If you're an outsider observing, you would say, I don't know, they have these phrases like, that's a power couple, or like, this is like such a happy couple, right? And I don't know the technical name for this, but they complement one another. In other words, two people get together, and by the way, and this is very controversial, but both with with their own narcissistic deficiencies or needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if he has the need to be admired,
Mm-hmm.
to be seen as powerful,
Mm-hmm.
great, intelligent, powerful,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are different types of narcissists. So you have the overinflated narcissist, but you also have what's called the deflated narcissist. That's more like what we call the craving or covert narcissist. But again, I
Okay.
won't go too far down that rabbit hole, okay? But the main point that I'm trying to emphasize is if he has this need for this admiration and he's paired up with somebody who has the need to admire
Mm-hmm.
and idealize and put somebody up on the pedestal, the
Mm-hmm.
two of them are like a match made in heaven. It's like a narcissistic blissful union,
Uh-huh.
right? And this kind of relationship can survive for many, many, many years as long as that dynamic doesn't break down or it's not interfered with. Yes, that's right. Because if, for instance, if she does something as simple as looking at another guy when they're at a restaurant, not in a sexual way, but just
Just
looking at
looking.
somebody, yeah, you see there's a little chink in the armor, or it sort of punctures that blissful union between them. And that can lead to a collapse then because the bargain that they have has been broken.
Mm-hmm.
Her gaze is for him only. So if that goes somewhere else, you can imagine this whole structure quickly begins to break down. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? I don't know if I...
No, that is precisely what they usually call a power couple. You
Mhm.
are right. But isn't that exhausting though? I mean, eventually, the narcissistic person is probably gonna get bored of all the attention, and the person who's giving all the attention is probably gonna be exhausted because of overgiving.
Wait, hold on. So I did actually, one of my early podcasts, I did it on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
And the argument that I made in my podcast was that the person doesn't just wake up one day and get bored. So I don't believe that that happens. And I know this is very common. You know, I hear this quite a lot when on social media, they have this whole cycle, you know, of like love, what's it like, love bombing,
Yeah.
right? And then
A
something,
switch.
yeah, because then they get bored, and then it's devaluation,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's hoovering, and then the whole cycle starts over again, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't subscribe to that theory because remember what I said when you and I first started chatting a couple minutes ago? The
Mm-hmm.
devil is in the details. You have to get really close to these people and these relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I believe that this thing shifts not because someone wakes up one day and they get bored, but there are very subtle things that happen. Like, for example, they're out at a restaurant and there's the gaze at another couple or another man or another woman.
Mm-hmm.
It's so subtle that most people won't even recognize it. And that's why they say, oh, they just get bored. I don't think they just get bored. I think something happens and they feel neglected, abandoned, rejected. There's a break in that bargain that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And then there comes the devaluation and all that the whole rest of that cycle.
Okay, so it's coming out of a defense.
It's coming from breaking the bargain, right? Not getting what they need, right? They need the supplies, let's say. They need the gaze, they need the admiration, they need the attention. And then when that doesn't, it is a defense, yes. So the short answer is yes. I was just sort of thinking through it. But we could be a little more specific if you like. So what's the defense? What have you heard? Have you heard it's a defense? I'm just curious.
So, okay. I have been told that they fear that they okay, I can swear this is my okay, yeah. That they'll fuck up.
Uh-huh.
That seems to be
Okay.
I've been told many times when they realize that they're gonna fuck up, that they start pushing the other person away so that they won't get abandoned. Because
Do they
then
really
they're
start, wait a
abandoning.
minute. wait, hold on. Let's think about this again. I need to slow this down. You know, my mind, I want to understand it. So what you've heard is something like somebody will, excuse the language, will fuck up, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Meaning what? What does that mean? Is that the example that I gave? Would that be an example of it with her eyes looking somewhere else? Or he shows up late for a date or something like that?
They could, yeah, probably not answer a call or be there for them when they needed it. Like
Okay.
maybe like a bad night, or maybe
Okay,
they
that's
just
good. Yep.
casually spoke to their ex, just like very normally spoke to their ex, not like a flirty conversation, probably just a normal conversation
Okay.
that didn't mean
Okay.
anything.
Okay, I'm with you. I'm with you. And then from there, what happens is they say, so then I began to push her away or him away after that incident.
Yes. I've also heard like okay, this is something I've actually so they start realizing that this is a permanent relationship, like this is actually going somewhere, and that they start feeling like they might screw up anytime soon.
Who's they? Who's the they?
Okay, okay. So let's
Wait,
say the
wait, 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 wait,
narcissist.
wait, wait, wait. Hold on, wait. Time out. 1 second, okay?
Okay, okay, okay.
We could talk about that one.
Uh-huh.
And I think I know what you mean by this. And this is like a whole nother topic we could discuss,
Okay.
which has to do with being in an intimate relationship where two people have feelings or developing feelings for one another,
Mm-hmm.
and what that experience may be like, you know, for somebody with narcissistic characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to finish the first one that you're getting at, right? So your first question was, if someone screws up something,
Mm-hmm.
that then they begin to attack them or push them away,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Correct.
So, and then I wanted to go back because you made this observation, which was an important one. You said this word, like, is it a defense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, what's a defense? So in this case, let me just play out the scenario, and then if I'm off the mark, you'll let me know, or we'll just push on, okay?
Okay, okay.
If they're in this blissful union, the
Mm-hmm.
narcissistic pair, magically, like everything is perfect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a break of some sort. They don't
Mm-hmm.
respond to a text quickly enough. They show up late for a date, whatever it might be. He becomes enraged at this point, like a narcissistic rage.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he will attack her, but we have to understand what's the goal. Is the goal to push her away and break off the relationship? That's why I was curious. Does that relationship continue,
Hmm.
or does it end? So that's one. Again, I know I'm like, there's so many different ways
No,
we
no,
could go.
yes,
So,
yes, yes, I know what you mean.
so that's one thing. But
Uh-huh.
the second way to go is to say, he is punishing her now
Mm-hmm.
because she becomes the frustrating other. She frustrated his need.
Mm-hmm.
You see, she frustrated his need for what? Attention, admiration, right? Unbroken. Like it's just exclusive attention for him. An
Mm-hmm.
immediate. Like there can't be any, like taking too long to respond to a text message. That's not acceptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he needs to punish her
Mm-hmm.
then. And that could be the aggression that you begin to see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the devaluation. And that helps, you see, that helps him a lot, by the way, because when you devalue somebody,
Hmm.
you're above them, you see. So
Correct.
now you're back to the core structure of the narcissistic personality, which is the illusion of perfection, the grandiose sense of self. So
Mm-hmm.
you are now reconstituting your narcissistic structure. You're
Mm-hmm.
no longer vulnerable. You don't feel hurt. You see, you don't feel hurt that she showed up late or missed the date with you or
Mm-hmm.
didn't respond to your text quickly enough. You feel empowered now
Is it
because
back?
you're angry. Yeah, and
Okay.
you're back up. And now you're reconstituted, right? Because you're back in control. You have the power again in your mind. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just gonna take that the power things that you just said. Let's say the narcissistic person is X, right? And their partner is Y, and someone comes up to Y and they compliment Y. And the narcissistic person doesn't feel jealous, but they feel good about it.
Okay.
This is so
Would-
stupid.
Let's just keep going.
So in that case, like, how does that not create like a dynamic where the person who's complimented has more power than the narcissist?
It might. I mean, that's all I could say is it might, because you know, I keep saying this, but I'm like a stickler for the details. So
Mhm.
I'd have to understand that a bit more. But it might, you know, there's so many different iterations to that. One is because they're in this union, right? There's no separation between the
Mhm.
two of them.
Mhm.
So a compliment for you is a
Mhm.
compliment for me,
Okay. All
right?
right.
Because
Okay.
there's what we call a lack of, again, I'm borrowing from a psychoanalytic, you know, from psychoanalytic theory. There's a
Mhm.
lack of what we call self-other differentiation.
Mhm.
That's the blissful union that I mentioned earlier. So if two people are merged in this kind of relationship and there's no separation, a compliment to you is a compliment to me because you belong to me. You are part of me. You are an extension of me. You're not your own individual person. So you get a compliment. I'm feeling pretty good right
Mhm.
now.
Mhm.
You see, so that's one iteration. That's one way it can go.
Okay, okay, that makes total sense. Okay, so when they speak about narcissistic people seeing their partners as an extension, this is what
Yes,
they mean.
yes, yeah. That you are part of me and
Mhm.
I'm part of you. That's that blissful union that I mentioned earlier. There's no separation,
Mhm.
right? And but let's think about that for a second.
Mhm.
Because again, I'm borrowing a term that you used a little bit earlier. You
Mhm.
used the term defensive. Remember that?
Mhm.
So in a way, we could say this illusion of togetherness with no
Mhm.
separation, no self-other differentiation
Mhm.
is a defense as well. What is it defending against? So if I see you as a separate person,
Mhm.
that means you have a mind of your own, right?
Ah, okay, yeah.
And if you have a mind of your own,
Mhm.
you could do something then that could hurt me, right? Like you could prioritize something over me,
Mhm.
and that would be hurtful because I need you so much. I need you to be there. I need you to always be admiring, adoring, seeing me as right. So if you have a mind of your own, or like the example I gave earlier with the gaze, your eyes go somewhere else,
Mhm.
that would be too painful for me to tolerate. But if I have this fantasy that the two of us are as one,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Then there's no loss. There's no separation. And
Wow.
life is a lot easier because we don't have to deal with separations, right?
Okay.
Here, let me give you a little example of this, okay? I make up this like just sort of again from the social media content.
Mhm.
But any of your listeners can fill this in because it's just very general,
Mhm.
which is you're going out on a date with
Mhm.
somebody, right?
Mhm.
And you're excited about seeing them.
Mhm.
You're looking forward to it. I actually did a podcast on this too. It was about a young woman who was looking forward to joining a sorority and
Okay.
very excited for bid day, and
Okay.
then did not get a bid to join her top two sororities of choice.
Okay.
And she went from a state of anticipation
Mhm.
that's elated, right? Like you're looking forward to the date,
Mhm.
complete devastation,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So, what happened here? And by the way, when you become completely devastated, when the date on the date, your boyfriend either looks at another group of people, let's
Mhm.
say,
Mhm.
or your boyfriend shows up late, or maybe he's tired, right? anyway, you could fill in whatever the separation may be, you could fill in, right, in terms of your own examples. But what happens is you go from a heightened state of arousal, anticipating a you know, like a blissful night, a union, to a deflated state, right? They come late. This woman doesn't get the bid to the sorority of choice, right? So what happens is what we call, again, borrowing from psychoanalytic theory. Well, one way to look at this is there's a mismatch, right? There's a mismatch. There's not like affective attunement. In other words, there's not somebody there who's on the same page as you. And that becomes quite devastating and brings back old trauma, which we don't have to go into right now. I mean, but at some point we may want to think about developmentally, like, where does this stuff come from? But then they have a choice what to do with this. Now they can attack the boyfriend, right? That's the narcissistic rage that I mentioned earlier. They can attack the boyfriend. They can storm out, right? There are so many different, right? They could feel depressed. Well, it's not really depression. It's really what I would call more like a narcissistic deflation, because they get so deflated and then withdrawn, right? And then they spoil the rest, not intentionally, but they may spoil the rest of the night. They're not really available, right? Because they're kind of pouting over this, right? So all of these are different iterations in terms of one incident that can play out, because the most devastating thing here is what? I'm just going back to where you and I started with this, is loss. That they have a really hard time tolerating the loss. They don't know what to do with it. And loss is more devastating for these individuals with narcissistic characteristics than many others. You know, like somebody who's like a garden variety neurotic, like a high functioning person. And oftentimes you hear this in the literature, in the social media content. I don't know if you've ever heard this word thrown around, but there's a word called object constancy.
Yes,
I don't
yes.
know if you've ever heard that. So I won't go too far into theory here, but I just want to explain why these losses are so devastating. Because early in development, if things go accordingly, there's a caregiver there who is very attuned, or look, we could use different words for this depending on what theoretical perspective you subscribe to, but it's a caregiver who's more or less there in a like affectively attuned way. There's what we call emotional resonance. We can call this containing. Winnicott calls it holding. You know, other analysts call it like a smiling mother, like a comforting mother, right? Right. So when you perform, you do something like you clean your room, for instance, your mother or father, caregiver, will be proud of you, right? They may smile, or it's called the gleam in the eye. They'll look at you in a certain way to say, yeah, I see the work that you put in. You put in some effort, and that's impressive, and you should feel good about yourself. What happens if there's enough of this? This is what gets taken into the self. This is what we call internalization.
Right.
So you begin to carry this around inside of you. It's almost like a smiling caregiver inside of you now. And why is this important? Again, I'm going to go right back to the example. I won't go too far into the rabbit hole of theory, but it's important at times of separation. Because if you carry this around with you inside of you, when you're alone, when something happens that is painful for all of us, by the way, right? But we all have different ways of dealing with painful situations, with dealing with loss. But if you don't have that sort of maternal care, I say maternal, I'm just going back to like the classical way they described it. I say maternal because a lot of the early research on this had to do with mother-infant dyads and mother-child dyads.
Right.
And because they studied this stuff empirically, and what they show is if you don't have that to fall back on, then you're incredibly alone. And at times of separation are really painful if you don't have, again, that complicated concept of object constancy. If you don't have something constant within you, smiling at you, separations are going to be very painful. because that internal caregiver does not get well integrated into one's personality, into one's sense of self. And that word integrated is really important because this is very popular too in the social media content, as you hear this concept splitting. So splitting, I mean, you hear it already. It implies there's no integration. The one way to define integration is you don't have that object constant, that constancy. You don't have that maternal smile. You don't have that holding environment. That's what's missing. And since when there's a separation, you don't have that to fall back on, then the sense of self can begin to collapse and fall into despair. I don't know if that made sense. I'm sorry if I went on too long there. I wanted to sort of frame us a little bit, okay?
But that was brilliant. And actually, I have two questions that branch out from that. I do want to talk about splitting, but I think I'll keep that second because I think that's a little more deeper. So I want to ask this. So you gave this example about like cleaning the room,
Yes.
right? Okay. So I don't know if this is even possible, but a lot of narcissistic, especially men I know, have very super obsessive moms. And I'm curious as to if let's say I'm narcissistic and when I was a kid, my mom or my dad consistently praised me for cleaning my room. Wouldn't that become a bit of a problem if I start operating from this rewarding system?
Yes. Yes. Well, let's get into it a little bit more. Okay. So
Okay.
if you are constantly praised for cleaning your room, we have to think about a couple things here. And I'm just reassociating to your thoughts. So please jump in again. I don't want to go too long. But
No, I love it.
one is, how much are you praised? Okay. Remember, the devil's in the details. Oh my God, that is amazing. You are amazing. This is the cleanest room I've ever seen. I cannot believe that you did this. I'm going to pick you up and parade you around. Let me put you on my shoulders and bring you out to all, right? That's very different. You see what I mean? And you can imagine that's a bit of a problem, right? Because now you're over gratifying the kid. Like everything that they do is so magnificent. It's so wonderful. And frustration is a big part of development too, and really important, right? So, okay, so that's one iteration. The second iteration is, if you get constant praise in that exaggerated way that I just gave, the specific way you get the praise is important too. If the mother or the caregiver says to you, I am so proud of you, can you see how that's different than that gleam in the eye that I mentioned earlier, which is, you should feel proud. You did a good job.
Right.
See, that's so different than I am proud of you as a person. In other words, you pleased me, right? So you pleased me now is a problem because I know what I need to do to make my mother happy. What if I don't do this? Will she be displeased with me? Right? Will she not love me? See, that's why the specific words you use are so important, because if you say, wow, what a wonderful job, you must feel so good about yourself, you could see already now the kid is not like it's a performance. It's not a performance for your caregiver. It's something for you. Now, okay, now there's one other, I'm sorry, there's so much to say from your comments. One more thing. One more thing. What happens when you don't clean the room perfectly, right? And you clean the room the best that you can, and then you present it to your caregiver, and they come in and they're like, you didn't do this, and you didn't do that, and your desk is still dirty, right? Now you've disappointed them. So you performed, and it wasn't worth anything. And if there's too much of that response from like an obsessive mother, right? If there's too much of that, this is then what gets internalized, that nothing I do is ever good enough. So why bother trying, right? You see, that will get internalized. I am not good enough. I am not worthy. I have no worth in my caregiver's eyes. I never do anything right. See, now that's also at the core of narcissism, isn't it? A worthless sense of self. But these little nuanced ways, and just in terms of how a caregiver responds to the act of cleaning a room, a simple example we gave, you could see has great meaning, right? I don't know, can you see that? Or what are you thinking as I say this? Does this make sense at all? Or do I
This
seem a
makes
little crazy?
no. I love that you're deep diving into this. And the problem is I have a lot of questions that are coming up, but I feel like they might branch out a little away from the topic. But I think I might just ask anyway.
Okay, let's see, because I want to, let's keep at, yeah, ask, let's see if it doesn't get too far away. Because at some point, what I like to do, if it's okay with you,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if your listeners are interested in this, but I always have my mind on,
Mm-hmm.
like, it's good to be able to describe these things like we're doing, right? And then it's good to understand where they come from, like how a caregiver may have behaved, how a child grows up with the feeling that they need to perform for a caregiver. So this leads into a whole nother hole, which we don't need to go into right now, but like a false self, narcissists also are often described as having a false self. In short, what that means is they are people pleasers. In other words, they try to figure out what people need so that they can perform, right? They perform because if they perform, then they're going to get that love, like I was describing in that example of cleaning the room, right? Like, oh, you're so wonderful. It's amazing. Look what you've done. So one is descriptively, which is like the bulk of the content out there, by the way. Then understanding where it comes from is really important because, again, this is my biased opinion, but you need a theory in terms of where did this come from? Because if you don't have a theory in mind that you can hold loosely in the back of your mind, how do you help somebody like this? And yes, I'm saying help them because I believe, not only do I believe, the research shows this, and I've been in practice with these patients for over, like 20 years, that they change, and that's, by the way, just as a quick digression, why I started the podcast is because I really wanted to present a different way of thinking about personality disorders and how they could be changed. Because a lot of the social media content suggests that they don't change. This is in their personality, and people don't change. Once a cheater, always a cheater. Yeah, and that is so far from the truth, and so sad to hear. But anyway, I'm hoping we could use a little bit of our time to talk about then what's necessary. Like, what's necessary? What do these people need in their life? What do they need to do to begin to foster, maybe more genuine relationships? Or, like that example we've given a couple of the woman who gets very upset when the boyfriend doesn't show up. How does one begin to, experience and accept the loss, right? Instead of collapsing or attacking, right? Anyway, so I just wanted to say that, but please feel free to jump in, and then maybe we can leave a little time for like what leads to change, okay?
Do you remember I told you I wanted to end this thing with one final question that might be a bit of a black hole that might take up
Well,
some time?
yes.
This was the question. I wanted to talk about change because, like you said, like most people think narcissists can't change. And I disagree too, but I wanted
Yeah.
I think the next question should be that. So I think we can deep dive into that for sure.
Okay.
Um, oh, but I have a question before that, and then we can move on to the change aspect because this is
Okay,
something
sure.
I
Yeah.
am super like the most invested in. So, oh yeah, so can you talk about splitting?
Oh, good. Okay.
Uh,
Yes. Let's
uh,
talk about splitting.
mhm,
Can you maybe just give me in your mind, like,
mhm,
what's in you could, in a very simple way, what's an example of splitting? What does that mean? It's a
mhm,
complicated concept, but
mhm.
let's kick it off and then I'll jump in, okay?
Okay. So I obviously Okay, so this is a bit of an overlap because a lot of people with BPD have told me the exact same feeling. So I
Mhm.
think people that are narcissistic feel very similar to people who are BPD when it comes to just splitting specifically.
Yes.
So during breakups, I've noticed this the most during breakups, where they will literally go from liking their partner to completely turning them into like this terrible ex
Uh-huh.
in the span of minutes.
Yes. Yeah, it's like black and white thinking,
Yeah,
right?
it's
That's
like
another way they describe it.
yeah.
Okay. So I think that's a very, very astute observation you made, which I don't
Mhm.
hear enough, which
Okay.
is there's overlap between
Oh.
BPD and MPD,
Mhm.
right? And so again, different theories on this, but one
Mhm.
theory says
Mhm.
that the core structure of both of these personalities is the
Mhm.
same. They
Mhm.
both have a fragmented personality.
Mhm.
So even people with narcissistic personality have a fragmented sense of self. In
Mhm.
other words, there's not that integration that I mentioned earlier. Remember I said you
Mhm.
need that integration. We called it what? Object constancy.
Mhm.
So you don't typically see the splitting
Mhm.
in the narcissist as much because they have that grandiose structure that I mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
The grandiose structure is I don't care. It's that dismissive attachment. It's the
Mhm.
illusion of perfection. And
Mhm.
that holds them together, right? Until it doesn't. And then when it doesn't, like the example of, like you just said, if there's some what hurt or something happens in a relationship, we can
Mhm.
even use the same examples just to be consistent. The woman that joins the sorority, that wants to join the sorority, she's
Mhm.
completely elated. She thinks there's going to be this magical union between her and the perfect sorority,
Mhm.
right? But she doesn't get her bid to her sorority of choice, and
Mhm.
she collapses. The woman looking forward to date night, she's
Mhm.
anticipating something, and then there's an affective misalignment. The boyfriend shows up late, or he's looking somewhere else, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, then you see a collapse, and that's the splitting. Then all of a sudden, you said in your example, right? They go from loving
Mhm.
to hating, right?
Mhm.
Am I getting this right? So from
Yes,
loving to
yes.
hating.
Hearing, yeah.
So this couples nicely with where I wanted to speak a little bit about technique in terms of how I
Okay.
work with this.
Mhm.
So when working with this, it's really important to keep in mind, I'm just using a little bit of language. When somebody is splitting,
Mhm.
they are what's called dysregulated.
Mhm.
So what's dysregulated mean? Uh, Many different ways to look at dysregulating, but there's heightened arousal. When there's
Mhm.
heightened arousal,
Mhm.
capacity for symbolic thinking goes down. So when symbolic thinking goes down,
Mhm.
all you typically see are accusations, attack, and this is splitting. It's
Mhm.
all this. You're always late. You're always looking at somebody else when we go out. You never want to hug me.
Mhm.
It's right. So affect is high. Affective arousal is high.
Mhm.
The capacity to think goes down, and
Mhm.
you're flooded with thoughts.
Mhm.
Now, thoughts are different than thinking.
Mhm.
Thoughts are typically persecutory in nature. And what I mean by that is they're critical, they're judging, right? Like, you're a loser, you
Mhm.
know, you're, I don't know, you could fill in the blank. When they go on the attack,
Mhm.
they're judging, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And this could change, by the way, when then they start attacking themselves. Narcissists are very, very judgmental. They
Mhm.
judge themselves and they feel constantly judged, right?
Mhm.
And there's a reason for that, but that's for part two of this. Okay, we don't want to go down that road. So they're in an aroused state. The goal
Mhm.
is bring them to help them get regulated. So
Mhm.
they're dysregulated, they're attacking, they're accusing, or they're being attacked in their own mind, right?
Mhm.
In other words, why were you late for the date? You're such a, you're this, you're that. And then they may switch and say, well, maybe I'm not, maybe you didn't care about me. What's wrong with me? Right now they're attacking themselves. I'm
Right.
bad. I can't, like this woman who didn't get the bid to her sorority. Suddenly it's like, am I awkward? Am I socially inept? Like, what's wrong with me? It switches very quickly.
Mhm.
So the first goal is to help them bring this down so that we can turn thoughts, which are persecutory, into productive thinking. Thinking means you have a capacity for symbolization. In other words, you want to begin to be able to think, he was late, or I
Mhm.
didn't get bid to the sorority.
Hmm.
What does it mean? How am I feeling right now? In other words, if I'm looking forward to a hug or some intimacy with my partner and they're tired and they're not interested in that, how do I feel about that? See, now we're moving into something. And I don't just mean I feel like a loser. No, right now you're dysregulated again. So you need to slow them. You have to actually say, wait, hold on a second. Can we slow down? I want to go over this again. I want to understand when you got very upset and you started to attack yourself in that way. Let's go back right before that. What was going through your mind? So this is what we do, because as long as they're aroused, nothing ever changes. You see, things won't be thought of in a new way. There's no nuanced perspective. There's no getting in touch with another side of oneself. Like, oh, that hurt. That's painful. When someone doesn't want to give me a hug or they blow me off, right? But the fact that it's painful is understandable. Of course it's painful. You know this. Look, if you're really looking forward to something and then it doesn't happen, you're
Right.
disappointed. And that's normal. Yeah, that's understandable. So that's, again, one of the initial steps in helping somebody like this is validation, right? That you validate a feeling, that it's okay to have this feeling. Now, what they do with the feeling is very different. We'll get to that in a moment, right? Because then when you start attacking somebody or attacking yourself, that's not the stuff you're validating. Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
go ahead. I see you want to jump in?
Yeah, that is some
Okay.
with regards to this very situation.
Mhm.
But wouldn't even taking a step back and being like, hey, how am I feeling? Means it's one step closer to empathizing with yourself. Like that seems to require empathy, wouldn't it?
And that's, I think, a little bit later. We're not there yet. That's a very sophisticated, like, you have to have a capacity to empathize with somebody or with oneself, and that will happen. But right now, I would just say it's sort of like exercising a muscle that you don't typically exercise, which is like self-reflection,
Okay.
thinking, slowing down and thinking and checking in with yourself. So it's not even empathy yet. Later, we'll get to that, okay? Right now, it's just, let me slow down. Let me not spiral. Let me not punish myself or somebody else. And let me just reflect on how I'm feeling. And why is it such a problem to feel disappointed? And then when we validate that, almost always, and I look, this is going to be very hard to believe, and your listeners may be like, this is, but when someone feels validated, immediately they become more regulated. And there's research that demonstrates this as well. And once you become more regulated, now you can start to talk to somebody and say, so what was going on inside of you when he did or she did this, right?
Yeah.
So now we're in a more reflective state of mind. Okay. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please jump in.
So in that state of, let's say, anger especially, what do you have like any suggestion or any tool as to like how you can tap into being self-aware? Of course, like you spoke about taking a step back and asking yourself that question, but then how do you suggest like do you push yourself to take a step back in that moment? Do you have any tips or have you seen anything?
So what has to happen, and
Mm-hmm.
look, this is not like the best answer to your question. Oftentimes people think
Mm-hmm.
that if you learn something like cognitively,
Mm-hmm.
that can help you emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
And the two do not pair. Like, for instance, they
Mhm.
have these people on, on social media who can
Mhm.
say, I know I'm projecting. I know this
Okay.
person is not judging me. Like, so
Mhm.
in other words, I don't have to get angry at them, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So cognitively, intellectually, they know this, but it does not put a dent in the way they respond.
Mhm.
So what has to happen then? What has to happen for them to not feel angry? Well,
Mhm.
why? First, then again, sorry if I drive you crazy with this, but we got to think,
No, I
why are
love
they
it.
angry? Why are they angry? They're
Okay.
angry because of a separation. In other
Mhm.
words, there was heightened arousal. I said they were anticipating a hug, or that their boyfriend would be excited to see them, or the text message, they would respond right away in the text message, or she
Mhm.
would get a bid to the sorority,
Mhm.
and then there's a disappointment. So this is what we call a mismatch. And
Mhm.
when there's a mismatch, like when you're excited about something and someone doesn't come in and it's not matched,
Mhm.
that leads to what's called a shame state. So
Mhm.
they become very ashamed. Okay. Think back to the example we gave of cleaning the room, that simple
Mhm.
example.
Mhm.
You're excited to present the room to your caregiver,
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
come in and you're excited, and they're like, eh, and they don't even give it a second glance. Like,
Right.
they have no interest in it.
Right.
That leads to a deflate. Like, that's very shameful. Like, because you were so excited. In other words, when you're excited about something,
Mhm.
you're vulnerable because you're putting yourself out there. You're putting your cards out there. You see what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
You're showing your cards. And if
Right.
someone doesn't respond, then all of a sudden that could lead to many things. But one thing it could lead to is a deep feeling of shame. And
Mhm.
shame is a big part of narcissism, as you may know from interviewing these people. So
Mhm.
that's what we call a shame state. Right. So anger could be a good way to go back to your example of feeling anger, could be a
Mhm.
good way to another patch. You see, that's another patch.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah.
shame is far more painful.
Mhm.
Anger
Mhm.
feels good, like you can feel really strong and powerful.
Mhm.
Shame, you feel weak and defeated and deflated, right?
Mhm.
So anger could be a defense against shame. Anyway, so to answer your question, what does one do if they're in a state where they're angry, right?
Mhm.
And they're listening to this, let's say they're listening to our interview, and they're
Uh-huh.
like, okay, I need to slow down
Mhm.
and reflect on
Mhm.
what's going on. And
Mhm.
by the way, when people listen to my podcast, I
Mhm.
get emails from people who try my techniques. And it's really interesting because they're
That's
like,
so cool.
typically I would blame, I'm married to a covert narcissist. And I would tell them, you're a narcissist. And I
Mhm.
would say to them, because we like exchange
Of
emails, like,
course. So,
"Yeah, but that's labeling them." They're like, well, I'm not labeling them.
uh-huh.
Like, that's a diagnosis. It's a formal diagnosis. So I'm not labeling them. And I said, but do you want to use like technical terms and like follow a diagnosis, or do you want to relate to your husband? Now, if you want to relate to him,
Mhm.
slow down and just think, what's going on here, right? Now,
Mhm.
what happens is when we do this enough and we slow down,
Mhm.
and you could picture this, imagine just you, like you're
Okay.
someone who gets angry, let's say,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Initially, it's going to be hard to slow yourself down. But if you
Mhm.
and I are practicing this every week and I'm slowing you down, and when
Mhm.
I slow you down, you begin to feel better. And I can
Mhm.
see it because you're more relaxed. And then you have a capacity to just be like, whew, all right, now let me think. And I'll say, how do you feel now? You say, I feel much better. But
Mhm.
so then, remember I used the word before, internalize?
Yes. Yes.
So if things go well, and by the way, they don't always go well because certain things block this from happening, which
Mhm.
is a whole other discussion. But if things go well, this is now what begins to get internalized,
Mhm.
right? Remember that smiling? Remember I said before, they don't internalize the
Mhm.
comforting, holding, containing,
Yeah.
smiling caregiver.
Yes.
So now this begins to get internalized. And that means when they have moments of loss, if this is something they begin to carry around inside of them. And by the way, patients tell me this all the time. They say, I was thinking about you. What would Dr. Mazzella say in this moment? See, that's really a good, that's the early stage of
okay.
internalization, which is called like mimicking. But that's good, nevertheless. Like first we mimic until we could really own it and make it part of ourselves, right? So they're like, sometimes, like, can I borrow that? You know, what you did with me, can I do that when I'm out there? It's like, yeah, sure, there's no extra charge. Take that with you. You know, like take it home, right? So they begin to internalize this. So that in moments of loss, then they begin to slow down and think, oh, what's going on here? Why am I so angry? I don't want to act this way. You know, this is the whole reason. This was the whole goal, was not to be so angry like this. I don't feel good when I'm angry. Oh, by the way, that's again, we're just making certain bookmarks for like maybe next time if we talk again. Some people do feel good. Some people do feel good when they're angry, but not everybody does, you know? And that's really another way the narcissist gets a really poor, bad rap, you know, like as if they have no capacity at all for empathy or putting themselves in somebody else's shoes. And that's just simply not true. Some of them are conflicted about the way they behave. But with that loss that comes up and that they don't have anything to fall back on, you know, until they start to internalize something else, it's like they have nothing else. That's why giving them these tools is so incredibly valuable in terms of the process towards change, if that makes sense.
That makes total sense.
Okay, good.
So, Ashley, this could be mixed up, but I think I can divide this part into 3 questions, so that will make it simpler. I want to speak about the empathy aspect. I do want to speak about because technically this is a step towards change, right?
Yes.
Right. So, so one question that I want to ask is it possible? Okay, like for example, how you said about them thinking, oh, what would Dr. Anthony say in this moment, right? So, what if the narcissist partner tries to push them in that space? Would that work, or would that just make it worse?
If they try to push them into which space, a more
The
reflective
introspective space.
state,
Yeah.
it depends on how they do it, you see?
What
Remember
do
the words, remember I'm very specific, so I'm sorry if I drive you crazy with this.
No,
but
I love it. I love it.
Right, because if they say to their partner, why don't you slow down and think about what you're doing and the impact it has on me? That's not going to work. Yeah, so it depends on how they do it. If they do it in a way like I do it, which is, hold on, slow down, wait, can we go back? I want to go over this again because I really want to understand. You seem pretty upset with me right now. What happened? What's leading you to get so upset with me? See, that's different, right? Because then you're validating, you're not invalidating, you're validating, saying, look, I understand you're upset. And let's think about this together. Let's talk about that. So it depends on how they do it. That's the answer to the question.
Okay, that's brilliant. So if in that sense, could a person in a narcissistic relationship make it work?
Which person?
A codependent, calmer partner.
Wait, hold on. Codependency, remember what we said earlier, there are different types of narcissistic relationships. The codependents, they're in that blissful union, remember? So that relationship is working. If they're both in that bubble, you see? But if you're asking me if they're not in the narcissistic blissful bubble of everything is like so magical and wonderful and we're like the power couple, right? The partner can have an incredible influence on their narcissistic partner, okay?
Oh, okay.
If And this is, again, remember I said earlier, I get these emails that people are trying my techniques. Remember, my husband's a covert narcissist. When they try the techniques and they slow things down and they try to understand what is going on, then I get emails later, like my husband and I are sitting on our porch listening to your podcast over a cup of coffee. You know, like they begin to relate. They relate to one another. Now, that doesn't mean it's all wonderful. Like they have moments, of course. But if you try to help somebody, now, but let me give one caveat to this, okay? The caveat, something that will help facilitate this process of relating is if the narcissist is in some kind of therapy. Like that would be really helpful. And they don't always want to go. Like sometimes I get these messages that they don't want to go to therapy. So then the spouse tells them, the partner tells them, well, at the very least, you need to listen to Dr. Mazzella's podcast, right? But some level of awareness is helpful, in other words.
Right. But I mean, you can't really, can you push your partner into being self-aware beyond a point? I mean,
No, the best you could do, I think, is validating. You know, and once you validate them, you get them from a dysregulated to a more regulated state of mind, they will become more self. Maybe you could call me Pollyannish. I'm a little overly optimistic, but I think when given the opportunity, when given the opportunity, and when we're in a more of a reflective, regulated state, I think, of course, many of us have some capacity. I'm not saying it's fantastic, okay? But we have some capacity to think, when we're regulated, remember, like really think through something. Absolutely. Yeah.
brilliant. So, okay, maybe I should ask the empathy aspect before, because I do, again, like you said, I don't think you're overly optimistic. I think this is how it should be. I think people are too pessimistic. So,
Well, people get pessimistic when what happens, unfortunately, is when you start criticizing and saying they're never going to change, or you start labeling them,
right.
and labeling them is like pathologizing them, right? So then you're pathologizing them. Back to the concept of splitting that you and I spoke about. We're still talking about it, by the way, because this is the initial stage in helping somebody who's splitting. There are other steps that are necessary to help them have a more integrated self, right? So that they don't split. But when people start criticizing, that is splitting, by the way. They're splitting because they're basically saying, like, you need to get out of this relationship with this narcissistic abuser, right? That's labeling. That's like dysregulation. That's splitting. And unfortunately, there's like, these people get a large following because it's just easier to label somebody and accuse them, because you don't really then have to think about that people come together in a relationship and there's a dynamic that goes on that serves both of you.
Right.
Like it's much more complicated than my husband's a narcissistic abuser. That's what I mentioned a little bit earlier. It's like, it depends on how the relationship comes together and what role each partner plays. So that gets a little more complicated. But to say someone is this or that, that's simple. That's like going to a football game and cheer for your team, on a Sunday afternoon. Life is easy. Give me a beer and let me cheer. This is the good guy. This is the bad guy. And everything is just so easy from there,
So labeling is part of splitting, you're saying?
From my perspective, labeling is part of splitting. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect.
Because labeling is not understanding. You're not understanding anything. You're just labeling it. I get a lot of calls, like people like, oh, can you diagnose me? I try to stay far away from that as possible. I mean, I guess diagnosis is valuable at some point, but I'd much rather just talk to you, see how you relate to people, see how you do at work, see how you feel about yourself, look at your securities and insecurities. Like, let's just talk instead of me giving you a label.
Okay. Is it possible, like, people who don't really, I mean, mostly people who are narcissistic have like issues around identity, so maybe a label would feel like something,
I
even
think
if it's
so.
not good.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're absolutely right. at least they say they have something now
Yeah.
so that they could work on it, you know?
Right. Right. Otherwise, like it's abstract. Like you don't really know what you are, so you don't know what to work on. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. Okay. So I really wanna, I think empathy would play into this question as well. So maybe I'll just ask. Like you said, you believe narcissists can change, right?
I see it. I mean, I see it
You
every
see-
day. I'm doing this. My full-time job is my private practice. So I'm with these people all day. Sometimes multiple times a week I see them. And
Mhm.
I see the way that they change over time. Yes.
So could you speak a little more about that?
Yeah,
Because
let me give you a very simple example.
Mhm,
I see it, you know, I work with individuals and couples, right?
mhm,
I
mhm.
also do what's called parental counseling. Remember before I showed you like the way like a parent would actually speak to the child,
Right.
like how important that is in terms of
Mhm,
building confidence and self-esteem.
mhm,
So many couples that I treat, this is
mhm,
very common in this field, is there's infidelity,
mhm,
right? So when there's infidelity, you're
mhm,
working with the people, sometimes even working with them individually, because you can't even
mhm.
put two people in the room because it's like chaos,
Right.
because there's too much anger, right?
Uh-huh.
It's not productive. It's not productive. Let me say it that way.
Uh-huh.
But what for somebody who has no regard for
Mhm,
somebody else, right? They went and had an affair. Empathy could be something as simple as this. This is just like
mhm,
a simple example. They're trying to repair the relationship so they're together, okay?
mhm, mhm,
And one of them wants to go do something and the other one doesn't. And
mhm,
let, let's just say she says, I don't want to do that because it's going to make me uncomfortable. It reminds me of the place where you cheated. Something, I'm
mhm.
just making this up, okay?
Right, right.
So he's like, what do you mean? We do this every year. We got to do this,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
That's a lack of empathy, right? So he's trying to bully her into doing something.
Right.
He's not listening to her.
Uh-huh.
So then she's like, oh, she gets upset. It escalates quickly. She walks away. So
Mhm,
the next day, he tells me, you know, I'm lying on my bed and I'm thinking about this. And I'm like, listen, if she's that upset about doing this thing because it triggers her, right?
mhm,
Of like me doing this thing with the woman that I had an affair with, something like that, right?
mhm,
He said, why would I do that if it triggers her? I don't
mhm,
want her to be upset.
mhm,
So I told her, listen, don't worry about it. We don't need to go do that thing. It's fine.
mhm. Okay.
That's that's what I would call, I don't know if that's what you had in your mind, but that's what I would call the development of empathy.
That
This
is
is now
empathy.
somebody,
That
yeah, who
that is
has a
empathy.
capacity, who has a growing capacity to say, and he didn't do this initially, I understand. So it's, these things are not perfect. It's like someone
Mhm.
doesn't change and all of a sudden it's like, whoa, like everything is completely, it's a
Uh-huh.
process. He didn't
Right.
do this initially. It took him like a day, but then he
Mhm,
had some space. See, there's the
mhm,
space and a more
mhm,
regulated state of mind, lying on his bed. And he said, if this is going to trigger her and
mhm,
upset her, why would I do this? Why would I push this? So forget it. We're not going to do it. And then he tells her, and he gives up on the thing that he wants to do. That's a, in my mind, this thing is small, but this is a big ship. Like, this is amazing. A guy
That
who's
is
just having an affair, has no regard for the, his wife, all of a sudden is thinking about her. So
right.
does that make sense? Like as an example, or
That makes sense. Like now you're pushing that person to think of their partner, even if it's small, it's significant because that's empathy.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Right. Okay. But okay, maybe I was thinking many times that people who are narcissistic do at certain points enjoy the um like they do want to trigger their partner because their partner triggered them or something like that. But I'm guessing that's not the same in like the situation. Like it wouldn't apply here, right? Like that would be
I would,
different.
I would say to that question
Mm-hmm.
that this is just again in my biased opinion, what I see
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmingly is that they
Mm-hmm.
don't intend. You see, the intention is not there to
Mm-hmm.
trigger the partner.
Mm-hmm.
not saying they don't trigger their partner, they do, okay? But it's not with the intent to trigger.
Okay.
It's with the intent. The intent is always to protect the fragile sense of self and assert one's omnipotence or grandiosity or control. You see what I mean? And when they have to get that control back, to remember, that's the whole structure of the narcissist, is the omnipotent sense of self. So they're doing it with the intent to maintain a cohesive sense of self. Because remember, the grandiosity protects against splitting. Both the borderline, we said, and the narcissist fragment. Remember, we said that earlier. And I said the distinguishing piece in my mind is the narcissist has the grandiose sense of self to hold them together. So you don't see as much splitting. You pointed this out yourself. You do see it at times of stress or separation. Like you could see it then, right? But in terms of intent, to get back to your question, the main difference, I think, between the borderline, who's full of rage, not anger, rage and hatred, which is different than anger, that there may be more intent there. But with the narcissist, more often than not always, okay? None of these things are absolute, like always, but more often than not, they're doing it to protect themselves. And when you call it out, they'll be like, what do you mean? I wasn't even doing, like, that wasn't, like, I don't understand, like, like they're so confused because they weren't meaning to hurt somebody and anger them. They were protecting themselves.
Right. Okay, so like if you call them out, they would start feeling shame and they wouldn't want to feel shame. So that would
If you
push them
call them
away.
out, you mean on it?
Yeah.
If you call them out on it, they're going to be very confused, right? Feel attacked, and most likely, yes, to protect against feeling ashamed, they can maybe feel shame, or they will counterattack. So then things will begin to escalate. Then you have two people who are in a dysregulated state, and things will spiral out of control from there.
Right. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's why, so just to review that, the main point was, it's not with oftentimes it's not with intent. It's to protect itself, assert one's dominance, or to be in control. Does that help? Or
That absolutely helps. Thank you so much.
you're welcome.
With regards to that as well, I just have the final question.
Okay, great. Yeah, one final question. I'm ready.
Ready? Okay, so how do you, I mean, obviously, this would help with self-regulation as well, maybe, but how do you suggest someone who is narcissistic can develop a sense of identity? Because I'm sure it is more difficult for them compared to people that are not disordered.
How do they develop a sense of identity? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Whew, what a way to end. Okay. So I want to stay somewhat consistent and not introduce too much more in the 11th hour, since we're wrapping things up. So maybe I'll answer this question like in a way of review. Okay. So one begins to develop a sense of identity from one perspective is, again, I go back to that concept of internalization. Internalization. Now, initially I gave an example of a patient who may want to mimic what I'm doing, copy me. And I said, this is an early stage of internalization, like actually doing something like I do. A higher level of internalization is when you take that in and it gets modified based on how you feel comfortable doing it. So you won't do it exactly like me, right? But you'll do it in your own way. So now you could see that once this gets internalized and integrated, you got to be integrated to have like a good, strong sense of identity, right? If you're not integrated, remember you're angry or you're depressed, like remember you're up and down, you're splitting, right? So once that gets integrated, it becomes part of one's personality. And that's how one begins to develop from this one perspective. What was the question? How do you begin to develop an identity? An identity is the personality. That's your personality.
Right.
You make it your own, but it happens from this one perspective through the process of internalizing internalizing, taking something in and making it your own.
Okay.
How does that sound?
That sounds brilliant. But
Okay, good.
would that keep changing though?
Well, there's going to be a core that
Mhm.
developed over
Mhm.
time,
Mm-hmm.
and change. Part of having a strong identity
Mm-hmm.
is the capacity to change. Absolutely.
All
There
right.
has to be a strong identity, means there's some fluidity,
Mm-hmm.
means that you could go from passive to active back to passive again. You see,
Right.
and feel comfortable. You don't lose your sense of self. In other
Uh-huh.
words, you could give up an argument and it
Mhm.
doesn't change who you are. So fluid. So yes, to answer your question, the core will be there in terms of what you internalize and carry around and becomes part of your structure. But a good, strong
Mhm.
structure allows for flexibility, not rigidity. Personality disorders are rigidity.
Mhm.
They're very rigid. They see things a certain way, and there's no movement from that. You're judging me, right?
Gotcha.
You think I'm worthless. That's rigidity.
Mm-hmm.
All right, good.
Okay. That was
All
brilliant.
right.
Okay, thank you. Oh,
Well,
let,
thank
let
you
me
so
just
much for having me. Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really appreciate us talking like this.
this was so much fun. Thank you for
You're
being
very
here.
welcome.
Okay, wait. Let me wait.